What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in for this World Cup preview edition of the show. As always, before I get going, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out on YouTube every single week. You can find all of my group previews there. I've already done separate videos previewing each group, looking at the biggest storylines, the names to know, all of those good things, so you can check those out as well. Before I get going with today, because this is exclusively a World Cup preview show, I want to take a second to acknowledge the incident that has happened. Reportedly, two people plus the assailant have lost their lives. There does not seem to be thankfully, any impact on the tournament itself. The teams, everybody seems to be safe and accounted for. But obviously, this is happening, you know, miles away, hours before this tournament is supposed to start. And so, obviously, heartbroken for the people involved, the friends and family of those who lost their lives. Hopefully, this is a very one off thing that does not become part of the story of this tournament. It's obviously very jarring for it to happen in places like Australia and New Zealand, where thankfully gun violence is not common like it is here in the United States. And so I did want to take a second to acknowledge that that event has happened. There's plenty of coverage of it. You can go read more about exactly what happened and how different federations have handled it and what they're saying and all of that. But as of what I found at the moment of this recording, no impact on the tournament itself. So once again, just thoughts and prayers with the victims, friends and families, and hopefully that is the end of that story as it relates to the World Cup. The first thing I'm going to do here in segment one is the same thing I did in December for the Men's World Cup. Going to kind of format this show the exact same way, starting with World Cup tiers, breaking down all 32 teams into four different groups using the same categories I had last time: underdogs, dark horses, contenders, favorites. So, my basic breakdown here: underdogs are the teams you're not expecting very much from, not expecting to be a major factor in the way that the tournament plays out. Your dark horses, I'm defining, generally speaking, as teams that have a chance to get out of a group that could potentially cause some issues for a team that's expected to get out of the group and steal their spot, send them home early, something like that. In a perfect scenario, maybe they can make a run, win a game or two in the knockout stage. I don't see them getting past the quarterfinals, though. And I will acknowledge I did have Morocco in this category for the Men's World Cup, and we all know what happened there. So just throwing that in as part of the equation as well. So these are it kind of breaks down as, team four, the top team in the group, second best, third best, and fourth best, but it's not that simplistic, and you'll see as I go along with that. The contenders, the differentiator for me between dark horses and contenders is kind of two things. One, can I actually see this team winning the tournament? And two, does this team have a real legitimate shot at making to the semifinals, making the final, where if they end up as one of the four teams left standing at the end, you're not that surprised by it. And then, of course, your favorites are the favorites. So here we go. Starting with the underdogs, I have 7 of them: Philippines, Costa Rica, Haiti, Vietnam, Panama, South Africa, and Morocco. 5 of these 7 countries are making their Women's World Cup debut. The 2 who have participated before, Costa Rica and South Africa, have played in 1 Women's World Cup. And this is the one that was pretty straightforward in terms of relating to the groups. 7 teams here. Obviously, you have 8 groups. It's one team from every group except for Group B. And I'll touch on that a little bit more when I get to the dark horses. But generally, these are your 7 teams expected to finish at the bottom of their groups. And these are the teams that I have a hard time seeing find a way to even get to third, where there's just clearly a gap between that third team and the fourth team. Like I said, right, most of these, these are kind of also generally speaking, some of the teams that benefited from the fact that the tournament expanded. And so you're seeing a lot of debuts, a lot of really inexperienced teams that are still kind of building their women's programs, those kind of things. So those are my 7 teams there. Don't have too much else to say about that. There they are. Dark horses. I have 11. And I'm going, this list, I should have said this earlier, the list is in order of the groups, and then alphabetically within the groups. So, dark horses, New Zealand, Switzerland, Ireland, Nigeria, Zambia, China, Portugal, Jamaica, Argentina, Colombia, Korea, South Korea. Like I said at the beginning, these are teams that have a chance to get out of the group stage that I could see advancing to the knockout stage. New Zealand have some reservations, but I can't put you in the underdog category when you're playing at home and you have World Cup experience. And you've been at least remotely competitive. There's a world in which they could have a decent tournament. Couldn't put them any higher than dark horses, certainly, because I don't expect them to get out of their group. But it wouldn't be the strangest thing in the world. And then, you kind of look down this list. Switzerland, Ireland, obviously, established European teams or strong soccer culture in the case of Ireland. I'll get to them a little bit more in a minute. And then it's some of your, again, a lot of these third teams in the groups that I'm not necessarily picking to get out of the group, but I wouldn't be shocked, and I kind of laid out this out in my group previews, if some of these teams end up being one of the 16 left in the knockout stage. The other part of this is I don't see these teams making deep runs. Maybe quarterfinals in a best case scenario. But especially with the way that the disparities that are still in the women's game, I don't see any of these teams in the semifinals. A couple teams I'm most interested in, kind of the intrigue here. I mentioned Group A. New Zealand, Switzerland. Switzerland is the team that is supposed to be that second team. They are one of the weaker second teams, which is why I put them into this category with New Zealand, and I would not be stunned if New Zealand found a way to top Switzerland and get out of that group. Same kind of situation in Group H with Colombia and South Korea. This is South Korea's second spot to lose. However, Colombia is really progressing nicely. You're seeing all kinds of very positive upward trajectory type things with that country and where this program is. The gap is not that large between these two. So I feel differently about some of these quote-unquote second teams that I put in here, specifically Group A and Group H, than I do about the rest of the teams that are expected to get out of groups that I put into the contenders category. The other two things I want to highlight quickly here. Group B. As I mentioned, this is the one group I did not have any underdogs, because Ireland just has too much talent, especially now that it sounds like Denise O'Sullivan is going to be okay. Great news on that front after that very scary, bizarre situation in the warm-up game. And Nigeria. These are teams in another group that would have a real chance of advancing. They just happen to also be drawn with Australia and Canada, and these tiers don't correlate to groups necessarily. I'm not trying to break it group by group. I'm trying to separate all of the teams and look at them in a vacuum. And so absolutely, Ireland, Nigeria, from a talent perspective on paper, much more dark horses than underdogs. So Group B, to me, is the deepest, toughest group because there is no easy game there. And then you also have Argentina in here. It's a group that includes Italy and Sweden. So again, you're not necessarily expecting Argentina to get out of it. But of these teams, I might be the most confident in Argentina. It's probably Argentina or China. I almost kind of considered bumping them up into the contenders, but ultimately I just didn't have enough faith in them. So those are some of the teams in this dark horse category that I'm interested in that I think could make some noise in this tournament. So if you're looking for somebody, I'm also really excited to see what Jamaica can do. Don't think it's going to result in getting out of a group. But some of these teams, when you're talking Jamaica, Zambia with their attacking talent, Argentina, Colombia, Korea, China, there are some really good teams in here that are top 15, 20 teams in the world. There's just this line that I couldn't put them above with the contenders. But that's what the dark horses are for. Is if you tell me South Korea ends up in the quarterfinals, especially with their group and the way things could line up for them, I would not be surprised at all. I'm not picking it to happen, but there are plenty of same thing with Switzerland, Argentina, China. You could tell me just about anything in Group B and I wouldn't be floored. It's becoming much more interesting from this perspective on the women's side, which is really exciting that these aren't even your tier 2 teams. These are your tier 3 teams. And I'm excited to watch them. They have really good players. They're going to be a factor in this tournament, which is awesome to see. That's what you want, is the elevated level of competition. You're seeing it at the top of the sport, and you're also seeing the depth improve and the number of quality teams improve. And we're going to see that in this tournament. Then we go to the contenders. There are 10 of them. Norway, Australia, Canada, Spain, Japan, Denmark, Netherlands, Brazil, France, Italy. As I said at the beginning, these are teams I could see getting to the semifinals. These are teams that you could talk me into a world in which they win the whole thing. Wouldn't pick it, but these are kind of your secondary favorites, if you will. Would not be surprised at all if they end up in the semis, if they end up pulling off an upset against one of the favorites. I do firmly believe that there's a gap between these teams in the top 4, though. And I'll explain more about that when I get to the favorites. The closest 3 that I thought about moving into the favorites category: Spain, Brazil, France. Norway, I love this team. I really love this team. I can't sit here and call you a favorite. Talent-wise, they're not quite there. And also, they haven't delivered in major tournaments. I can't call you a favorite if you haven't done this before. Australia. Really like this team as well. I'm a big believer in the home field advantage when it comes to World Cups. Just not quite enough to go into the favorites category. Canada, I have concerns. Janine Becky's injury, the trying to get all of these players kind of back that have been injured over the past year or so. How do you follow up what they did at the Olympics? I see this being a disappointing tournament for Canada, so I'm certainly not putting them in the favorites. Japan, just the ceiling to me is the semis in a perfect world. And I think it's more realistically the quarterfinals. They just don't have the top end talent needed to get into the favorites category. Denmark, kind of the same thing. Don't have enough star power. Netherlands, Vivian Miedema is not there. That pretty much disqualifies you from being a favorite in my mind. And Italy is kind of the last team that squeaked into this group. I do believe in the overall talent here, even though they had a really disappointing Euros. But they are the bottom of this group for me, so they certainly are not going to be in the favorites. Then they've got the 3 teams I mentioned that I considered moving up. We'll start with Spain. Would I be stunned if Spain won this tournament? No. I have my reservations, though. One, Alexia Putellas is working her way back still. She is not firing on all cylinders, not at 100% game shape, doesn't have a bunch of 90-minute performances under her belt. That's a concern. More concerning, though, is the players who aren't there. And the fact that there's still this tension with the Federation. You got a bunch of inexperienced players who are now being asked to play much bigger roles that weren't supposed to. And on top of all of that, I do have a mental hurdle with the Spain/Barcelona core until I see them deliver against the best in the world. And I mean that in a very literal sense. This is one of the fascinating parts about the conversation regarding Barcelona's Champions Leagues for me. And of course, it's not the exact same thing, but there are plenty of players from that Barcelona team that are also on this Spanish national team. They haven't beat Lyon in a final. They've won in the years where Lyon hasn't reached the final. The Spanish team has all kinds of talent. Didn't reach and I know Alexia Putellas was injured, didn't reach weren't major factors at Euro 2022, didn't reach the final. I need to see them actually take that step. It's the same way I feel about Norway. The roster is terrific. The talent is there to win it. I'm just not putting you in the favorites category if I haven't seen you do it before. And if you are not clearly the most talented team at this competition. If they were at full strength and had everybody that they wanted, maybe they have to be in the favorites conversation. But that's not the reality of the situation. There are players who are missing. And so I'm not putting them in the favorites. Brazil, really like this team, really excited to watch this team. I think this team is being slept on a little bit. Again, though, just top-end talent, not quite enough to put them into the favorites. And France, I have concerns about the attack with the injuries. They just don't have the most depth in the world. They're also not maybe they're a top 5 team at full strength. They're probably more like 6 or 7. And so you take that down a level with the injuries to really important attacking players, and I can't put them in the favorites either. I feel very strongly that there is a clear line between this group and the 4 teams I'm going to talk about next. Doesn't necessarily mean that all 4 of these are, picking these 4 teams to make the semifinals, and I'll get to that in the next segment, and it probably won't work out that way anyway. But there are 4 teams that are justifiable to pick to win this competition. Anybody else, I think you're asking for a stroke of good fortune and for something unexpected to happen, which, of course, is possible. It's a World Cup. Who knows? But I just can't talk myself into a scenario. Really, the only team I can talk myself into is Spain. That Alexia Putellas all of a sudden looks like herself again, is the best player in this tournament, hands down. That's a world in which I could see Spain winning. That's pretty much the only team in this group that I feel that way about, that I can envision a scenario in which they win. Which gets to the favorites, the 4 teams I can envision winning this competition. Now, there is a little bit of a delineation here. Sweden is definitely team 4 in this for me. But when you're making the semifinals of every major tournament you play in, which is what Sweden have basically done in this World Cup cycle, you're getting into the favorites category. To me, they're also one of the 4 most talented teams in the world. I don't know what other justification there needs to be here. I feel much more confident in Sweden than I do in Spain or anybody else, which is why Sweden's in this category and everybody else were contenders. And then you've got the other 3. I said this in my group preview, I'll say it again. To me, at full strength, you give me one team, I want England. Of course, England is not at full strength, but you still have plenty to work with here, and you have players who made significant contributions to that Euro win coming off the bench that are now prepared to play bigger roles. Looking at you, Alicia Russo, Chloe Kelly, Rachel Daly can now play striker. There are some holes that need to be filled, but they have the ability to fill those holes. So, of course, they're going to be one of the favorites. Then you got the U.S., betting favorite, probably the most talented team on paper in this tournament. The U.S. is a favorite at any World Cup it goes to. That's number one. And number two, in a World Cup where you have so many players missing, the U.S. was able to call, Alyssa Thompson and Lynn Williams off the bench, didn't need Ashley Hatch. You can go down the list of the players who didn't make this team. Nobody has the depth of the United States. So they're obviously in the favorites too. And then there's Germany. There are at most two teams with a better chance of winning than Germany. That's England and the U.S. I've been a little bit surprised at how much momentum is behind Germany. I'm going to talk about whether I agree with that or not when I get to my predictions in the next segment. But the one thing I will say again here is if that Euro 2022 final is at a neutral venue, Germany probably wins. And if we're going to talk about England the way we've been talking about England over the last year, and justifiably so, we got to be talking the same way about Germany. And so those three teams immediately went in. I also went with Sweden just because I think there is a clear gap between Sweden and everybody else. So those are my four favorites. Those are your World Cup tiers.